You know how some places just feel like they're stitched into your soul? For me, that place was Grandpa Henry's house in Evanston, a sprawling Victorian beauty on Maplewood Avenue. Every time I stepped through those creaky wooden doors, it felt like stepping back in time. The faint smell of cedarwood mingled with lavender potpourri Grandma used to keep in every room. The walls were lined with faded photographs of our family, smiling faces frozen in moments I could barely remember but somehow still cherished. I grew up spending weekends there after my parents died when I was 6. It wasn't just a house. It was home base for all my happiest memories. Summers meant lemonade on the porch, while Grandpa told me stories about how he bought the house decades ago, practically penniless, but determined to give his family roots. Winters brought cozy nights by the fireplace, where he'd read aloud from old books or teach me chess. Those lessons weren't just about strategy, they were about life. Think 3 moves ahead, Sophia, he'd say. Anticipate what others might do before they even think of doing it. Little did I know then how much those words would come to define my future. But as much as I loved the house, not everyone in the family shared my sentiment. My Uncle Robert, Dad's younger brother, always had this air of entitlement around him. He was slick, charming even, but you could tell he cared more about appearances than substance. Aunt Margaret, his wife, was no better. She lived for gossip and social status. Their kids, Claire and Ethan, were carbon copies of their parents. Claire, 2 years older than me, acted like she ruled the world, while Ethan, well, let's just say he spent most of his time scrolling on his phone, completely oblivious to anything meaningful. Family gatherings were awkward at best. Robert would make snide comments about my career choice, graphic design, as if it wasn't practical enough. Margaret would chime in with her fake smile, asking why I hadn't settled down yet. And Claire loved to remind me how lucky I was to have grown up in such a beautiful house, as if it somehow made me spoiled. Meanwhile, Ethan would sit quietly, occasionally muttering something under his breath that nobody paid attention to anyway. Don't get me wrong, I try to stay out of their drama. But deep down, I knew there was tension simmering beneath the surface, waiting to boil over. When Grandpa passed away last spring, it hit me harder than I expected. Sure, he was 87, and we all knew his health wasn't great, but losing him felt like losing a piece of myself. The funeral was small, just close friends, neighbors, and family, but the real storm came later during the reading of the will. That's when everything changed. Uncle Robert showed up wearing one of his expensive suits, looking like he already owned the place. When the lawyer announced that Grandpa had left the house solely to me, citing some sentimental line about how I understood the true value of home, Robert practically exploded. "What do you mean? Solely to Sophia?" he demanded, slamming his hand on the table. "This house belongs to all of us. Henry must have been confused when he wrote this nonsense." I wanted to scream, to defend Grandpa's decision, but instead, I sat there frozen, clutching the edge of my chair. Margaret gave me this icy glare like I'd stolen something precious from her. And Claire, she smirked, whispering loudly enough for everyone to hear. Figure she'd find a way to take everything. The next few weeks were a blur. Robert hired some high-profile attorney named Mr. Whitaker, who specialized in estate disputes. Apparently, he was known for bulldozing over people in court, and now he was coming after me. I didn't stand a chance, or so I thought. Thankfully, my best friend Mia recommended Nathan Harper, a lawyer who worked pro bono cases for artists and creatives. When I met him for the first time at his office downtown, I immediately liked him. He was calm, thoughtful, and genuinely seemed to care about helping me protect Grandpa's legacy. Nathan explained that Robert's argument would likely focus on questioning Grandpa's mental state when he updated the will. "They'll try to paint him as senile," Nathan said, leaning forward across his desk. "But we can counter that with evidence of a sharp mind right up until the end." He suggested gathering letters, emails, and even witness testimonies from people who interacted with Grandpa regularly. Still, the weight of it all pressed down on me. Fighting this battle meant draining my savings, juggling work deadlines, and facing the very real possibility of losing the house forever. Some days, I wondered if it was worth it. Then I'd walk past the framed photo of Grandpa on my nightstand, and I'd remind myself, yes, it is. The legal battle felt like a game of tug-of-war, except I was outnumbered and outgunned. Robert's team moved quickly, filing motions left and right to delay proceedings or discredit my case. They even managed to secure a temporary injunction against me selling or making any major changes to the house until the dispute was resolved. It was infuriating, like they were treating my home as some bargaining chip instead of a place filled with memories. Every time I walked into the house, I half expected to see Robert lounging on the porch, sipping coffee like he owned the damn place. And then there was Claire. She took it upon herself to spread rumors around town, painting me as this greedy opportunist who didn't deserve the house. "Oh, poor Sophia," she'd say in that fake sweet tone of hers whenever someone mentioned the lawsuit. It must be so hard for her to deal with all this attention after taking everything for herself. The worst part, people actually believed her. Neighbors I thought were friendly started avoiding me at the grocery store, whispering behind their hands when I passed by. It got to the point where I stopped going out unless absolutely necessary. I felt isolated, like I was fighting not just Robert but an entire army of doubt and judgment. Some nights, I'd lie awake wondering if maybe they were right, if holding on to the house was selfish, if letting go would make things easier. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't about money or pride. It was about honoring Grandpa's wishes and preserving something that mattered far more than either. One rainy Saturday afternoon, while sorting through boxes of old documents in the attic, I stumbled across something that changed everything. Tucked inside a dusty leather-bound folder was a copy of the original deed to the house. At first glance, it looked ordinary, a formal document written in dry legalese, but one line caught my eye. In the event that ownership of this property is transferred outside the direct bloodline of Henry Bennett, said property shall revert to the city of Evanston due to its historical significance. My heart skipped a beat. Could this really be true? Was this some kind of loophole Grandpa had built into the deed decades ago? I called Nathan immediately, practically shouting into the phone. "You need to come over right now," I told him. When he arrived, I showed him the clause, explaining what I'd found. He studied it carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Sophia," he said finally, "this could be huge. If we play our cards right, this might be the ace up your sleeve." Of course, he warned me not to mention it to anyone, not yet. Timing was crucial. Still, knowing I had the secret weapon gave me a renewed sense of hope. For the first time since the lawsuit began, I allowed myself to imagine winning, not just for me, but for Grandpa. As I sat there in the dim light of the attic, surrounded by relics of the past, I whispered softly, "Thank you, Grandpa. You always did think 3 moves ahead." Despite having the fine print tucked safely away, things weren't looking good in court. Mr. Whitaker, the smug lawyer representing Robert, was relentless. He argued that allowing me full control of the house during the trial posed a risk to its preservation. "Miss Bennett has no experience managing such a valuable property," he declared dramatically, gesturing toward me like I was some reckless teenager incapable of responsibility. To my horror, the judge agreed, granting Robert temporary custody of the house under the guise of maintaining its condition. Walking out of the courtroom that day felt like being punched in the gut. Robert smirked as he shook hands with his lawyer, clearly reveling in his small victory. Claire shot me a triumphant look, mouthing, "See? Karma!" Meanwhile, I stood frozen, clutching the strap of my bag, so tightly my knuckles turned white. That night, I drove back to Chicago feeling utterly defeated. The city lights blurred through tears streaming down my face. How could this be happening? The house wasn't just a building. It was my sanctuary, my connection to Grandpa, my anchor in a world that often felt chaotic and unfair. And now, thanks to Robert's scheming, it felt further away than ever. Losing temporary custody of the house hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just about the legal setback, it was the emotional toll. Knowing that Robert now had access to a place so deeply tied to my heart made me feel violated, like someone had taken something sacred and turned it into collateral damage. But as if that weren't enough, the financial strain started piling up too. Between lawyer fees, court costs, and the rising cost of living in Chicago, I was barely keeping my head above water. Freelancing had always been unpredictable, but lately I couldn't focus on anything creative. Deadlines slipped, clients grew impatient, and my once thriving career began to crumble right alongside my personal life. To make matters worse, Claire decided to move into the house temporarily, claiming she needed space to think after breaking up with her boyfriend. The audacity of it all made my blood boil. She posted pictures on Instagram of herself lounging on the porch swing or sipping wine in the parlor, captioned with hashtags like #newbeginnings and #homesweethome. One evening, while scrolling aimlessly through social media, a bad habit I'd picked up during sleepless nights, I came across a photo of her standing in the dining room holding a glass of champagne. In the background, I noticed blueprints scattered across the table. Blueprints! My stomach churned as I zoomed in closer. They were plans for renovations, tearing down walls, replacing original woodwork with modern fixtures, even adding a ridiculous glass extension to the garden. This wasn't just negligence, it was vandalism. I felt sick imagining what Grandpa would say if he saw them treating his beloved home like this. That night, I cried until my pillow was soaked, wondering how much more I could take before I broke completely. When things seemed darkest, Grace Thompson, the elderly neighbor who'd known Grandpa for decades, showed up at my apartment one chilly October morning. She carried a thermos of hot tea and a plate of homemade cookies, which she placed on my kitchen counter without asking permission. "You look like you need these," she said bluntly, giving me a pointed look. We sat together at my tiny table, and for the first time in weeks, I let my guard down. Through tears and shaky breaths, I poured out everything. The lawsuit, Robert's antics, Claire's betrayal, the looming threat to the house's integrity. Grace listened intently, nodding occasionally but never interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and sighed. "Henry always knew Robert would try something like this," she admitted quietly. Her words shocked me. Apparently, Grandpa had confided in her years ago, expressing his fears about Robert's greed and lack of respect for family traditions. "He trusted you, Sophia," Grace continued, "and he believed in your strength, even when you didn't believe in yourself." Those simple sentences lit a spark inside me, a reminder that I wasn't fighting alone. Over the next few days, Grace rallied the community. She introduced me to local historians and preservationists who shared stories of the house's significance to Evanston's history. Together, we drafted petitions and organized protests outside City Hall, urging officials to protect the property from being altered beyond recognition. For the first time since the battle began, I felt a flicker of hope, not because I thought winning would be easy, but because I realized I had allies willing to stand by me no matter what. Despite the support from Grace and others, there were still moments when doubt crept in, whispering cruel lies in the dead of night. One particularly rough evening, I found myself driving aimlessly through the city, eventually pulling over near Lincoln Park Cemetery. I hadn't visited my parents' graves in months, not since the lawsuit began, but something drew me there that night. Standing between their headstones, I felt an overwhelming mix of guilt and grief. Had I failed them somehow? Failed Grandpa? What kind of person holds onto a house when it causes so much pain? As I knelt on the damp grass, tracing the engraved letters of their names with trembling fingers, I heard Nathan's voice in my mind. He'd said something similar during our last meeting. Sometimes, holding on isn't selfish, it's brave. Maybe he was right. Maybe letting go wouldn't solve anything. Maybe it would only prove Robert's accusations true. Still, the weight of everything felt unbearable. When I finally stood up to leave, I noticed a text from Nathan waiting on my phone. "Thinking of you tonight," it read simply. Something about those 4 words softened the edges of my despair. For the first time, I allowed myself to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there could be something more between us than just shared adversity. With Grace by my side, I started piecing together evidence that could expose Robert's true colors. It wasn't easy. Digging up dirt on family members felt unnatural, like betraying some unspoken code of loyalty, but I reminded myself why I was doing this. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, for Grandpa, for the house, and for everything they represented. Grace proved invaluable in this process. She introduced me to a retired accountant who had worked with Robert years ago and knew all about his shady business practices. Apparently, he'd been involved in several questionable property deals, including one where he forged documents to claim ownership of a historic building downtown. Armed with copies of those documents, courtesy of the accountant, I felt a surge of determination. If we played our cards right, this could be the ammunition Nathan needed to discredit Robert in court. But preparing for war wasn't just about gathering evidence. It was also about fortifying myself emotionally. Some nights, I'd sit alone in my apartment, staring at photos of the house or flipping through old letters Grandpa had written me over the years. Each word carried weight, reminding me of his wisdom and faith in me. "Think 3 moves ahead," he used to say. So that's exactly what I did. With Nathan's guidance, we devised a strategy: keep the fine print clause hidden until absolutely necessary. Using it too soon might alienate other family members or make us look desperate. Instead, we'd focus on dismantling Robert's credibility step by step. Still, the pressure mounted daily. Every phone call from Nathan, every email update from Grace, set my heart racing. Was I ready for this? Could I handle the fallout if things went south? On particularly bad days, I'd call Maggie, the friend who recommended Nathan, and vent endlessly. She always listened patiently before offering the same advice. "Breathe, Sophia. You've got this." And somehow, hearing her say it made me believe it, even if only for a little while. The day of the trial arrived faster than I expected, or maybe time had simply blurred together during those stressful weeks leading up to it. Walking into the courthouse felt surreal, like stepping onto a stage where everyone's eyes were trained on you. Reporters hovered outside, snapping photos and shouting questions as Robert strutted past them in his expensive suit, looking smug as ever. Claire clung to his arm, flashing a practiced smile for the cameras. Even Aunt Margaret looked polished, her designer dress hugging her frame like armor. Meanwhile, I stood quietly beside Nathan, clutching my bag so tightly my fingers ached. Inside the courtroom, the air buzzed with tension. Mr. Whitaker wasted no time launching his opening arguments, painting me as an opportunist who manipulated Grandpa in his final days. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, pacing dramatically in front of the judge's bench, "what we have here is a case of undue influence." Henry Bennett was elderly, frail, and vulnerable, a perfect target for someone seeking personal gain. His words hit like punches, each syllable designed to chip away at my credibility. But then it was Nathan's turn. He stepped forward calmly, his voice steady and commanding. "This isn't a story about greed," he countered. "It's a story about love, about a grandfather who cherished his granddaughter and entrusted her with the legacy of their family home. Everything we present today will prove that Sophia Bennett is not only the rightful heir, but also the best guardian of this historic property." As he spoke, I glanced around the room. Robert scowled, Margaret fidgeted nervously, and Claire rolled her eyes theatrically. For the first time since this nightmare began, I allowed myself to feel a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the truth would prevail. The second day of the trial brought testimony after testimony, each one pulling the narrative in different directions. First up was Uncle Robert himself, taking the stand with an air of false humility. He recounted tales of how close he'd supposedly been to Grandpa, claiming they shared a special bond rooted in mutual respect and trust. The jury seemed skeptical, especially when Nathan cross-examined him. "Mr. Bennett," Nathan said coolly, "you mentioned that your father trusted you implicitly. Can you explain why, then, he explicitly excluded you from the will?" Robert stammered, clearly caught off guard. I don't know," he muttered, glaring at Nathan like he wanted to strangle him. The exchange elicited quiet laughter from the gallery, though the judge quickly silenced it with a sharp rap of her gavel. Next came Grace Thompson. When she walked to the stand, leaning slightly on her cane, the entire courtroom fell silent. Her voice trembled at first, but as she spoke about Grandpa's values and his unwavering belief in me, her tone grew stronger. "Henry loved that house," she declared, pointing a bony finger toward Robert. "And he loved Sophia more than any of you realize. To suggest otherwise is an insult to his memory." Robert tried to undermine her testimony, accusing her of senility and bias. But Grace didn't flinch. She leaned forward, fixing him with a steely gaze. "If anyone here doesn't understand the value of family," she snapped, "it's you, Robert." The jury nodded approvingly, and for the first time, I saw cracks forming in Robert's confident facade. By the third day of the trial, I thought I'd seen everything Robert and his family could throw at me. But then came Claire. That evening, as I was leaving the courthouse, she appeared out of nowhere, blocking my path near the parking lot. "We need to talk," she said sharply, her arms crossed over her chest. Her tone was urgent, almost desperate, which threw me off guard. Despite everything, there was still a part of me that remembered her as the cousin who used to braid my hair when we were kids. Against my better judgment, I nodded and followed her to a quiet corner away from prying eyes. "What do you want, Claire?" I asked warily, bracing myself for another verbal attack. Instead, she surprised me by lowering her voice. "Look, Sophia, I know you're not going to like this, but here's the deal. Drop the case, and I'll make sure Dad leaves you alone." She paused, letting her words sink in before adding, "He doesn't care about the house. He just wants to win. Give him what he wants, and you can walk away with your life intact." I stared at her, stunned. Did she really think I'd trade Grandpa's legacy for peace? Before I could respond, she leaned closer, her expression darkening. "And if you don't, well, let's just say I have some dirt on you that might change people's minds about whose side they're on." My stomach churned. What dirt? Was she bluffing? Or did she somehow uncover something embarrassing from my past? Whatever it was, her threat hung heavy in the air between us. A stark reminder that this battle wasn't just about the house. It was personal now. The next morning, Nathan and I arrived at the courthouse early, strategizing how to counter whatever bombshell Claire might drop during her testimony later that day. We knew we had to stay one step ahead, but honestly, I felt like I was walking blindfolded through a minefield. When Claire finally took the stand, dressed impeccably in a tailored blazer and pencil skirt, she exuded confidence. Mr. Whitaker guided her through rehearsed answers designed to paint me as manipulative and ungrateful. "Sophia always resented our family," she claimed, her voice dripping with false sincerity. She thought she deserved special treatment because she lived with Grandpa after her parents died. But the truth is, she manipulated him into leaving her the house. It was infuriating hearing her twist reality so blatantly. But Nathan didn't miss a beat. During cross-examination, he zeroed in on inconsistencies in her story, forcing her to backtrack repeatedly. Then, seizing the moment, he pulled out copies of Robert's forged property documents, the ones Grace's accountant friend had provided. "Miss Bennett," Nathan said smoothly, holding up the papers for everyone to see, "can you explain why your father engaged in fraudulent activities involving these properties?" Claire froze, her polished demeanor cracking under the weight of his question. For the first time, she looked genuinely rattled. I don't know anything about that," she stammered, glancing nervously at Robert. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Nathan pressed further, exposing more of Robert's unethical dealings. By the time Claire stepped down from the stand, her carefully constructed facade had crumbled entirely. With Claire's credibility shattered, it was time to play our trump card. As the trial entered its final stages, tension filled the courtroom like a storm cloud ready to burst. Nathan stood up slowly, addressing the judge with deliberate calmness. "Your Honor," he began, "there is one final piece of evidence that must be considered in determining the rightful ownership of this property." He handed over the original deed containing the fine print clause, the stipulation that if the house ever left the direct bloodline, it would revert to the city of Evanston due to its historical significance. The room fell silent as the judge examined the document. Robert shot out of his seat, sputtering protests, while Margaret buried her face in her hands. Even Claire looked pale, realizing the implications of what Nathan had just revealed. "This changes everything," Robert shouted, pointing an accusing finger at me. She withheld this information deliberately, but Nathan remained unfazed. "On the contrary, Your Honor," he countered, "this clause has been public record since the property was deeded decades ago. It is not Miss Bennett's responsibility to educate opposing counsel about legal details they failed to investigate thoroughly." The judge nodded thoughtfully, clearly weighing the gravity of the situation. For the first time since the lawsuit began, I allowed myself to breathe. Not fully, but enough to feel a flicker of hope. This was it, the turning point we'd been waiting for. The judge took her time deliberating, and those few minutes felt like hours. Every tick of the clock echoed in my ears as I sat rigidly beside Nathan, clutching the edge of the table so tightly my knuckles turned white. Robert paced anxiously near his lawyer, muttering under his breath, while Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Claire avoided looking at anyone, staring fixedly at the floor like she wanted to disappear altogether. The tension in the room was suffocating, but beneath it all, I felt something else, a strange sense of calm. Whatever happened next, I knew I'd fought as hard as I could. That thought alone gave me strength. Finally, The judge cleared her throat and addressed the court. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, she began, her voice steady and authoritative, this court finds in favor of Miss Sophia Bennet. The property located at 42 Maplewood Avenue shall remain in her possession as per the explicit wishes of Henry Bennet and the stipulations outlined in the original deed. A wave of relief crashed over me, so intense it nearly knocked me off balance. Tears blurred my vision as I exhaled sharply, realizing I'd won, not just for myself, but for Grandpa. Across the room, Robert slammed his fist on the railing, his face red with fury. "This isn't over!" he bellowed before storming out, dragging Claire behind him. Margaret followed silently, her head bowed in defeat. As the courtroom emptied, Nathan placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You did it, Sophia," he said softly. "You held on when it mattered most." For the first time in months, I allowed myself to smile, a real, genuine smile that reached my eyes. Justice had been served, and the house was mine again. Winning the lawsuit didn't magically fix everything. The house still bore the scars of Claire's temporary stay, scratches on the hardwood floors, paint splatters on the walls from aborted renovation attempts, and an unsettling layer of dust coating every surface. But as I stood in the doorway on my first day back, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. This place wasn't perfect, it never had been, but it was home. And now it was safe. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into restoring the house, determined to erase any trace of Robert and Claire's intrusion. Grace proved invaluable yet again, rallying neighbors and local volunteers to help with repairs. Together, we scrubbed floors, patched walls, and polished woodwork until the house gleamed like new. One Saturday morning, as I sanded down the porch railing, Nathan showed up unexpectedly with coffee and bagels. "Thought you might need a break," he said, handing me a steaming cup. We sat together on the steps, watching the sun rise over Evanston. For the first time in ages, I felt peaceful, not just because the house was mine again, but because I wasn't alone anymore. Between Grace's unwavering support, Nathan's quiet encouragement, and the kindness of strangers who rallied around me, I realized I'd gained something even more valuable than the house itself, a community. A few weeks after the trial ended, I decided to confront Robert, not because I wanted to reconcile, but because I needed answers. Not for me, necessarily, but for Grandpa. So one crisp November morning, I showed up unannounced at his office downtown. He looked surprised and slightly irritated to see me standing in his doorway, but he gestured for me to sit anyway. The room smelled faintly of leather and expensive cologne, a stark contrast to the warmth of the house I'd fought so hard to protect. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Robert broke the silence, his tone clipped and defensive. "What do you want, Sophia? Haven't you done enough?" His words stung, but I refused to let him bait me into anger. Instead, I took a deep breath and met his gaze steadily. "I came here to ask why," I said simply. "Why did you fight so hard for something that never belonged to you? Why couldn't you respect Grandpa's wishes?" To my surprise, he didn't lash out or deny it. Instead, he sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair. "You wouldn't understand," he muttered. "It's not about the house. It's about proving I'm just as good as Henry thought you were." His admission caught me off guard. Beneath all the greed and manipulation, there was pain. Pain I hadn't considered before. Did that excuse what he'd done? No. But it helped me understand him a little better. When I left his office later that day, I didn't feel hatred anymore. Just sadness for the fractured relationship we'd never truly had, and for the fact that some wounds might never fully heal. As the days turned into weeks, Nathan became a constant presence in my life. At first, it was practical, helping me sort through legal paperwork, advising me on how to properly document the house's historical status. But gradually, our conversations shifted from logistics to laughter, from strategy sessions to shared silences that felt oddly comfortable. One evening, as we sat together on the porch swing watching the sunset, he turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You know," he said softly, "you're pretty incredible, Sophia Bennet." My heart skipped a beat. "Don't start," I teased, trying to lighten the mood. But he didn't laugh. Instead, he reached over and took my hand in his. "I mean it," he continued. "You've been through hell this past year, and yet here you are, stronger than ever. I admire that more than you realize. In that moment, something shifted between us. It wasn't dramatic or earth-shattering. It was quiet, like the first snowfall blanketing the world in stillness. Over the next few weeks, our relationship deepened naturally, built on trust and mutual respect. We dreamed together about turning the house into a cultural hub, a space where artists could gather, historians could share stories, and families could create memories like I once had. With Nathan by my side, the future no longer felt daunting. It felt full of possibility. The house was finally ready, restored to its former glory, filled with light and laughter once more. To celebrate, Nathan and I organized a charity gala in honor of Grandpa Henry. It wasn't just any event. It was a tribute to everything he'd stood for: family, resilience, and the importance of preserving history. The night of the gala, I stood nervously at the top of the grand staircase, watching guests mingle below. Local historians, artists, neighbors, and even some distant relatives who hadn't sided with Robert had come together to support the cause. Grace was there too, resplendent in a lavender dress, holding court near the fireplace as she regaled everyone with stories about Grandpa's quirks and kindness. When it was my turn to speak, my hands trembled slightly as I gripped the microphone. "Thank you all for being here tonight," I began, my voice wavering before steadying itself. "This house has been through so much. It's seen joy and heartbreak, love and loss. But tonight, it feels alive again." I paused, looking out at the sea of faces illuminated by candlelight. My grandfather believed in the power of home, not just as a building, but as a place where people connect, where memories are made, and where legacies endure. This house is his legacy, and now it's mine to protect. With your help, we're going to make sure it continues to inspire future generations. As applause filled the room, I felt tears prick my eyes, not from sadness this time, but from gratitude. For the first time in years, I felt like I truly belonged somewhere. In the weeks following the gala, life settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. I decided to move back to Evanston permanently, trading my cramped Chicago apartment for the spacious rooms of the Victorian house. It wasn't an easy decision. Leaving behind the city meant stepping away from freelance opportunities and late-night coffee runs, but it felt right. Every morning, I woke up to sunlight streaming through the stained-glass windows, reminding me of why I'd fought so hard to keep this place. Nathan became a permanent fixture in my life, too. He helped me draft plans to transform part of the house into a creative workspace for local artists, a dream I'd secretly harbored since the trial ended. Together, we envisioned workshops, exhibitions, and community events that would breathe new life into the property. Slowly but surely, I embraced my role as a guardian of both the house and its legacy. People started calling me the keeper of Maplewood Avenue, a title that made me smile every time I heard it. Though the scars of the past lingered, the fractured relationships, the sleepless nights, they no longer defined me. Instead, they reminded me of how far I'd come and how much stronger I was because of it. Late one evening, after everyone had left the house and the quiet settled around me like a warm blanket, I sat at Grandpa's old desk in the study. The room smelled faintly of cedar wood and ink, just like it always had. In front of me lay a stack of blank stationery, pages waiting to be filled with words I'd been meaning to write for months. Picking up my pen, I began addressing the first letter to Grandpa. "Dear Grandpa," I wrote, pausing for a moment before continuing. "I wish you could see what's happening here now. The house is alive again, full of laughter, creativity, and purpose. I think you'd be proud of how far I've come since you left us. There were days when I wasn't sure I could keep fighting, days when it felt easier to give up than to hold on. But then I'd remember your voice telling me to think 3 moves ahead, and somehow those words carried me through. Tears blurred my vision as I scribbled on, recounting everything: the trial, Robert's betrayal, Claire's threats, Grace's unwavering support, and Nathan's quiet strength. Writing it all down felt cathartic, like releasing pieces of myself I'd been holding onto too tightly. By the time I signed off with "Love always, Sophia," my heart felt lighter than it had in years. That night, I tucked the letter into an envelope and placed it alongside others I'd written to my parents over the years. They weren't meant to be sent. They were reminders of where I'd been and how much I'd grown. As I turned off the lamp and climbed the stairs to bed, I realized something important. I wasn't just carrying their memories anymore. I was creating new ones. The house wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a bridge to the future, a place where stories would continue to unfold long after I was gone. Over the next few months, the house transformed into exactly what I'd envisioned, a vibrant hub of creativity and connection. Artists set up easels in the sunroom, historians hosted lectures in the parlor, and families gathered for storytelling nights by the fireplace. One Saturday morning, I stood on the porch watching kids chase each other across the lawn while parents laughed nearby. It was a scene straight out of my childhood, a reminder that some things never change, no matter how much time passes. The community embraced the project wholeheartedly, donating funds, supplies, and even their time to help maintain the property. Grace became a sort of honorary historian in residence, leading tours and sharing anecdotes about the house's storied past. Even Maggie stopped by occasionally, bringing homemade pies and offering sage advice. "You're doing good work, Sophia," she'd say with a wink. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Meanwhile, Nathan and I continued dreaming up ways to expand the house's reach, applying for grants and partnering with local organizations to host workshops and events. Through it all, I found a deeper sense of purpose. This wasn't just about honoring Grandpa's memory anymore. It was about building something lasting, something that would endure beyond me. Every nail hammered into the walls, every brush stroke on canvas, every story shared within these rooms added another layer to its history. And though I knew challenges lay ahead, maintaining funding, navigating bureaucracy, keeping the vision alive, I faced them with confidence. After everything I'd been through, I knew I could handle whatever came next. The seasons changed, and so did I. Spring arrived with a burst of color, daffodils blooming in the garden, sunlight streaming through freshly cleaned windows, and the sound of laughter echoing from every corner of the house. One evening, as the golden hour bathed the porch in warm light, I stood there with Nathan by my side, watching the world slow down around us. It was one of those rare moments when everything felt perfectly aligned, the past, present, and future converging into a single heartbeat. "I never thought I'd end up here," I admitted softly, leaning against the railing. "When this whole mess started, I wasn't sure I could survive it. But now," my voice trailed off as I glanced at him, his profile softened by the fading sun. He smiled, reaching over to take my hand. "But now," he prompted gently. "Now," I said, feeling a warmth spread through me. "I feel like I've finally found where I belong. Not just in this house, but in this life. With you, with this community, with the legacy Grandpa left behind." Nathan squeezed my hand, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You've earned it, Sophia. Every bit of it." His words settled over me like a blessing, affirming what I'd come to realize, that happiness isn't something you wait for, it's something you create, piece by piece, moment by moment. Together, we had built something beautiful out of chaos, turning pain into purpose and loss into love. As twilight deepened, the first stars began to twinkle above us. Inside the house, the faint hum of conversation drifted through open windows, mingling with the clinking of glasses and bursts of laughter. The gala attendees had long since departed, but their energy lingered, a testament to the connections forged within these walls. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to truly relax, to let go of the fear that had driven me for so long and embrace the peace I'd fought so hard to achieve. Standing there on the porch, surrounded by the people and places I loved most, I felt complete. The house wasn't just a building anymore. It was a symbol of hope, resilience, and unity, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, beauty can emerge. And as I looked out at the horizon, where the sky melted into shades of pink and orange, I whispered a silent thank you to Grandpa. "Thank you for teaching me how to think 3 moves ahead," I murmured, smiling despite the tears welling in my eyes. "And thank you for trusting me to carry the torch." With Nathan's arm wrapped securely around my shoulders, I turned back toward the house, ready to step inside and face whatever lay ahead. The road wouldn't always be easy. I knew that, but I also knew I wouldn't have to walk it alone. For the first time in my life, I felt truly at home, not just in the house, but in myself. The screen door creaked shut behind us, and the sound of laughter echoed once more, filling the spaces between the beams and rafters. As darkness fell over Maplewood Avenue, the house glowed warmly, a beacon of history and hope. Life wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. All it needed was heart, and this place had plenty of that.